So again, this is the first session of People Take Power, our series of discussions with radical organizers working inside and outside of electoral politics. I'm Calvin Zheng Miao, I use he and him pronouns, and with the Left Inside Outside project. You can learn more about us by going to OrganizingUpgrade.com and clicking on the statement, The Left We Want to Build. So let me just run through the agenda really quick. We are going to hear presentations of about 5 to 7 minutes each from Rukia Lumumba from the amazing campaign to elect Chokwe Antar Lumumba as mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. And then from Rafael Návar, who's the National Political Director of Communications Workers of America. And we'll learn a little bit about their really fantastic political development program. After that, Sendolo and the featured speakers will have a kind of free open-ended conversation back and forth for about another 15 minutes, trying to draw out some of the key themes and questions that came up during those presentations. And then we'll wrap up probably just a little bit after 6, and Joseph Schwartz from DSA, if circumstances permit, will just give us a heads up on what's coming next for us. All right, cool. So why don't I turn it over to Sendolo if there's anything you want to say to introduce the speakers?
Sure. So good evening, everybody. I'm Sendolo. I use she and he pronouns. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be in this conversation with y'all. As everyone who's getting on this call knows, holding the contradiction of how do you bring a left, a socialist, a revolutionary politics inside of the existing political arena as a means of moving forward our work is just a really challenging contradiction to hold. And one of the things that I have found most useful, a lot of comrades I'm connected to have found most useful, is being able to have direct conversations with people who are in there holding that contradiction. It's a really different thing to be debating, should we hold the contradiction? Is it an arena we want to play in? Than to say, actually, we have folks who are in there, and here's how we're doing it. Folks who are trying to build people power. And so the two folks who we have featured for this conversation are folks who've been in the thick of those struggles and in the midst of those contradictions. And we really want to be lifting up and listening to them for what their insights are. And then as Calvin really laid out for us, we're going to have an opportunity to raise questions.
All right. I think Sendolo is going to say we're going to have an opportunity to raise questions directly with these wonderful practitioners. So with that, I think why don't we go to Rukia?
So just unmuting myself. So good evening, everybody. Free the land. Just thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this call. Thank you to the organizers for having this call. You know, Sendolo started speaking very strong and powerful message of what it really means and how we need to support each other in this process of actually governing in a way that is where we keep people central to our governing process. And we actually began to shift the tide where people are not only central, but they are truly exercising democracy and controlling government, right? That they are truly who government goes to for the true leadership, right? And so I just really am grateful for this space, and I look forward to being a part of future calls that are happening, future sessions, because I think we need it. So again, I am Rukia Lumumba, and I use she and her pronouns. I am a lawyer by training. I'm a human rights activist, and I'm the daughter of the late Mayor Chokwe Lumumba and Nubia Lumumba. If you all are having any trouble hearing me, just type it into the chat box, and I'll try to adjust my sound. You know, I speak my parents' name because they left a big legacy for my brother and I and our comrades in the movement to fulfill. They dedicated their lives to truly the creation of a better world, and it is now our responsibility to continue that mission forward. I'm a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, and I'm founder of the People's Advocacy Institute, which is dedicated to really building new institutional power. And I had the pleasure of serving as the co-coordinator and campaign manager of the successful campaign to elect my brother Chokwe Antar Lumumba for mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. So very excited about that. But now the harder work begins for us. And as we're talking today about how movement really kind of sets the tone for governing, right? And for our decisions to run for office. Excuse me, I'm caught in my cord here. You know, what comes to mind to me is this understanding that the basis of every movement is the creation of better conditions for the people most impacted by the denial or infringement of their right to a good quality of life. And so, you know, we can go back to even the 1970s, right? And I like to tell this story about the group of women, children, men, including elders, that called themselves the Republic of New Africa, that journeyed to Edwards, Mississippi, to begin the development of a new community that was truly rooted in safety and security from state violence in the form of state-sanctioned lynchings. And they did so because, you know, they were searching for a better life. And years prior to that, prior to the RNA, the expression of people's power reemerged time and time again in communities in Mississippi as a means to resist systemic exploitation. And, you know, some of the last great expressions of the people's self-determined power in Mississippi occurred in the early 1960s and was stimulated by movement, by campaigns coordinated by resistance organized by local leaders like Medgar Evers that drew on the national capacity and courage of organizations like the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and drew on CORE. And these campaigns created the democratic space necessary for communities in Mississippi to organize themselves to resist more effectively, right? Broad participatory-based institutions, what we now call here in Mississippi people's assemblies, were the most common form of this self-expression. And one of the most memorable outgrowths of this wave of people's assemblies in Mississippi was the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged the control over the Black vote. And today we continue that work in our movement, right, to end police violence, and in our campaigns nationally to expand revolutionary progressive power that centers place and people in city government and planning, right? And so as I'm on this call tonight, you know, I had to ask myself, you know, in talking about movement, what do I want to really express tonight and hope to obtain feedback around? And that's this idea, this idea that I believe most, if not all of us on the call believe, is that community, right, is central, not peripheral to the movement for social justice and racial equity. And too often, communities in which Black, trans, and poor people reside are engaged only as an afterthought when planning reform and or solutions to local and national problem issues, right? We think about healthcare and education and criminalization. And too often, government tells us what they're going to do as opposed to engaging us in that process, right? And so we believe that grassroots organizations, that faith and spiritually centered organizations, that neighborhood organizations, that individuals and local communities are most effective in doing the work that is transformational and liberating for our people. And this belief lies in some core values, right? One is that community needs to demand the right, the responsibility, and the resources for ensuring the safety and well-being of its residents. Two, Black people, people of color, people most impacted by poverty, formerly incarcerated persons, and young people and their families are assets to be developed and should have a voice in developing and designing programs and policies that affect them. And 3, that we have to pay attention, close attention, to the marginalized people to the people that sit at the margins of our society, to those that are currently incarcerated, to those that are differently abled, to those that are not giving full rights even within their respected class or race, right? And so, and in doing so, right, we truly can meet the need to create something better than what currently exists. And I can talk more as we go through questions and answers about how I propose, or we propose here in Jackson, to do that. So thank you again for your time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Rukia, you see I'm wearing my Cooperation Jackson shirt.
Yeah.
Hey, hey.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. And Navarre, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Passing it over to you.
Cool, thank you. And thank you everybody for having me on this call and for organizing this really, I think, critical discussion. And it's an honor to be here with Rukia and everybody else, and much respect to you, Rukia, and your family for keeping that legacy of struggle in one of the most difficult terrains, I think, that exists in this country. I want to start off with, before I get into the story of what some of the work we've done here at CWA, I want to start off with a couple assumptions and that I think frame the work. The first one that I wanted to state is that I think the majority of working class folks engage in essentially electoral politics is the kind of avenue or terrain where you can engage for political struggle in this country. The second assumption is that for the many who don't engage at all in that electoral system, that the only vehicle or potential place to engage in political struggle, the idea is for many, majority I would argue in the working class, is essentially electoral politics in that terrain. And then I'll just add that that's kind of changing in a scary way. I think that's being unraveled in many ways. And there was a Vox article recently that said that from the 90s, you had 1 out of 16 Americans thought military rule was a good idea. Now it's 1 out of 6 in 2014, which is pretty alarming. But that's unraveling. That's the second assumption. The third assumption that I want to state is that unless if you were maybe, either part of an organization, a historic organization that gave you, that you were able to expose to a really deep historical analysis, or maybe you did a PhD on it, that majority of working class has been robbed of a history of essentially the collective action that we've taken for huge victories that for the working class, right? And so majority of the working class will look at, or we're told, it's, this individual, this president, this, et cetera. That's who's carried out the process of victory and change. So we're robbed of this analysis and this kind of history, right? As collective agents of our own movement for justice and dignity and liberation. So given those assumptions, going into our work and our history, one of the primary things that we focused on is that the work we're really in is building individual people, developing leaders and developing essentially activists who have an analysis, a very clear class analysis, that have a skill set and that are able to engage in fights and learn how to fight, want to fight, and can fight on any fight, whether it be a contract, organizing a strike, or a electoral, right? And so that we're really in the business of, and our focus is developing individuals. That's really what the premise was of our program. And that if we win, or if we engage on a fight, whether it be an election, at the end of that fight, are we stronger? Do we have more leaders? Do we have more volunteers? That's really the gauge that we were doing. Now, the victory obviously the election is critical, but that many times you could win an election and lose power, right? And you won't gain anything, right? Mm-hmm. So we really understood that we were trying to build our own independent political power within the union. And an example of this is in 2012, which was my first year at CWA, I worked for another labor union before I did that community organizing. But here, we established first-time 2% goals for volunteer recruitment within the union on political activity. If you hit 2% in the union at that year, you were at the top of the game for your state. If the majority of states did not hit 2% goals, and in the broader labor movement, if you were at 1%, you're at the top of the game of the labor movement. I speak to this is because we have a massive base that is essentially, though organized in many different ways, can still not reach its full potential in any in a capacity, especially on political struggle, whether it be electoral or not. That said, we really focused on doing that through developing a political boot camp system, a program, a political activist development that we'll call shorthand boot camps. And if you can put that up screen, Rishi, I'd appreciate the second slide so I can go over it. What I'm going to show you now is really kind of the structure of and the tiers of the boot camp. The problem I'm not going to go over, so if you can just focus on the training and focus on the follow-up. You know, the training is made up of 3 main components, although training is really 6 weeks. It's a whole follow-up program. But the first bucket you see is the consciousness raising, which is like an ideological formation. I'll come back to that a bit. Then you have a skills component, and then you have the campaign that we're engaged in. Going to the first piece, this is really the most significant and the most critical, I would argue, right? Because it is what really gives folks the ability to see this historical struggle that working class people have been engaged in, to show that what we won on any front, whether it be for racial justice or be for economic justice, et cetera, it's been through collective action. And this piece really speaks to that. It's broken into 3 buckets. I won't go into detail now. The only one I'll lift up is that the other struggles piece is kind of a misnomer. But the way we frame this is that what are quote unquote other struggles that are perceived to be outside of the labor movement, but that are actually one and the same and that many of our folks are a part of, but are that we should link up. And this is really to address the divisions within the working class in this country and really go at the heart of essentially, you know, some of the most divisive pieces, and also the legacy of racism for different communities. I'm going to show you, this is the tier 1 development, and I'll come back to what it looks like in tier 2. The skills piece is really, again, to focus on the development as organizing capacity, on the skills part, developing organizers, developing their capacity to talk to other members, go from 2%, 3% to 5% of our members being engaged, and every year tracking and building that. And then the last is the campaign, and the campaign could be in a legislative fight, but it could be an electoral fight. And the key thing here that I want to stress is that, you know, this is really, it's important to have these short-term immediate fights because it allows to test our ability, our growth, allows us to see how much we've grown, and also, you know, what our capacity is as a union, but also can get us short-term victories like an increase in minimum wage in a city, or elect a champion, like be a part of working towards electing a champion like Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson. And so this is really that. And it also helps us expose the true nature of power, right? In immediate fights. It's the actual practice of struggle that gives folks the ability to perceive, you know, who has power. Because when you actually start to engage and lobby on an issue or elect, you start to see all of the money in a very detail. You start to see, you know, what the Chamber of Commerce is doing. You start to see all these forces and how they are actively trying to go against working class interests. And so I think this brings the analysis that you've told in a historical level in a very immediate fight. So that said, you know, I'm going to end that. This bootcamp we've been doing it for several years. This is like the 4th iteration. The follow-up program is like 6 weeks, which is really important for the development. And I think I'm going to end it with that. You know, we've really been able to transform a lot of folks, plug them into work, grow every year, and really had some big victories that we've been able to be a part of.
I'm going to start some back and forth conversation with Raphael and with Rukia about what their experiences have been. But as we're going, folks should be generating those questions, sending them to the question box. Wanted to encourage people also, as much as possible, to use headphones that just allow us to reduce any kind of like extra audio pieces. Yeah, So from there, just want to jump in. And Raphael, you kind of ended with this piece about some of the things that y'all have learned through your engagement around building independent political power. And I just wanted to ask both of y'all, Rukia and Raphael, what do y'all feel like you have won or gained through entering into this arena?
Yeah, so I can go. This is Rukia. So there's a lot that we've learned, and of course a lot that we've gained. And before I even go into that, one thing that we gained is community on a broader scale. I just want to sincerely thank CWA, and I mean so many members, Sendolo, I mean so many members on this call right now for the support, because this was really a collective win. And it wasn't just a win for people in Jackson, although it was definitely central to us. But I really do believe that it was a win nationally, because we just had such great support. And I'm going to be honest, that support fostered our win, right? And we're going to continue to need that support to actually run a successful people-centered government. And so one of the things that we've gained is absolutely broader community, right? What we've learned is a whole lot, right? We learned not only a lot about ourselves and our organization, and I'll say that what the key thing is that what I learned in this process is that how the principles of your organization and how you define the decision-making process within your organization, how you truly implement the goals of your organization internally and externally really helps you in your organizing on a political level, because you don't leave those things behind, right? When we entered city government, you know, we entered city government with the principles that had guided us here. And those are the principles of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, in which we truly believe in centering community and believe in working towards self-determination for all people, and holding even the very leaders that we have chosen accountable, right? And understanding that we don't have all of the answers, that the answers come from the collective will of the people. So really having to maintain that, right? Maintain your principles from the organization that you originally came from. That's one thing that we learned and gained, and I feel like I'm holding too much time. So Raphael, you should.
No, please.
Well, before going over to Raphael, I just had one kind of follow-up around that, Rukia. You were talking about building community and implementing those principles. And just wanted to see if there was like a juicy example for us, right? That like, one of the things, it's easier to have principles when there's not contradictions, right?
Yeah.
And so as deeply and as much makes sense on a recorded video, just wanted to ask you, like, what's a really good example for us, right? So we can really be like, if someone was going to step into this work and say yes to it, what's a place where you're like, the principles of Malcolm X grassroots movement really came up against a contradiction. And then because of our orientation to people-centered politics, we were able to like overcome something or accomplish something.
Yeah. So I'll give you a past example from my father's administration, and then I'll give you a more recent example from our short term thus far, only just being out of 100 days, right? So with my father's administration, you know, we one of the campaigns that were led while he was in office was a 1% sales tax campaign, where the people of Jackson had the ability to vote to either tax themselves an additional 1% to help with dealing with the $1 billion infrastructure issue that is present. Now, it is not a principle of the Malcolm X grassroots movement to force or to even encourage the masses of people to exert more funds and capital towards a government entity that already should be serving them in the first place, upon which things should be free, right? And so even in doing that, right, like being in government and in a position where you have to be transparent, you have to, there are some protocols and procedures that exist that you have to follow until they're able to be shifted. And so having to put that vote to the people and then having to follow the people's decision, right? Even when you didn't agree with it, right? That's principled, because the core of the Malcolm X grassroots movement and the core of Cooperation Jackson is this idea that the masses of the people, right, that the people's decision outweighs any decision of the individual or the organization, right, if that makes any sense. So, you know, membership didn't all agree with taxing ourselves, but we had to follow that through, right? And so that's a contradiction. That's one issue of contradiction. And it passed nearly by 99%. The people of Jackson decided to tax themselves. Sometimes we don't know what we think we know, right? We think we know more than the people know. And we have to really step back, right? That's one thing. The other thing more recently is that, you know, Amilcar Cabral says, you know, that we can't claim easy victories and we can never tell lies, right? We can tell no lies to the masses of our folks. And so I was recently faced with a very difficult situation where the state currently is attempting to take over the Jackson Public School District, which is the second largest school district in the state and is the largest Black school district in the state and has one of the highest budgets. And we have been working, I as a liaison for the mayor's office has been working in coalition with community, with a particular coalition group of community members. And, you know, I set up meetings with the mayor, I do all of this. And one of the key things that we had to do was come up with a plan to present to the governor. The mayor's office had to. And ideally what we want to do, and we had to do it within a short period of time, within about a week or two, a little less than a week. And within that time period, there was no real capacity from the mayor's office to get feedback from the coalition in the way that we would have ideally wanted to. And so I had to be transparent with this coalition and say, you know, though the mayor's office wants to, I can't guarantee that your feedback is going to make it into this plan that's headed over to the governor's office in a couple of days, right? And that may seem very small to you, but when you're talking about people's, including mine, when you're talking to people who are living and are going to be most impacted by the decisions that are made based on a plan that you present, and you propose to be a people's government that's going to consistently censor people first, it is hard to hear that your ideas and opinions may not make it into the plan, right? And so that causes tension as well, right? And so having to deal with even those minor things that some may consider minor, but we look at as central and as actually big things, right? Because we want to create processes where we are always censoring the voice of the people. But sometimes we also have to trust our chosen leadership, that they're going to do what's in the best interest of the people based on the history that we know, right? And so that's just another example of, you know, because I could have done like many politicians have done in the past and say, oh yeah, your feedback will be included. And it never even, the mayor never even look at it, right? So we have to be true to our principles of telling no lies. And though the people may have been mad that their feedback wasn't going to make it into this plan, what they understood is that we were trustworthy and that we were truthful and that we were not going to lie to them. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Rukia. And yeah, just that tension of like, how do we build like mass democracy while at war, right? So I also want to hear from Raphael about what he's seeing in terms of victories. And we just have this great setup where we have folks who are in a local, right, in a city, working things out in that specific administration. And then CWA, who's one of the largest unions in the country and definitely on the kind of leading edge of fighting for independent political power for our folks. So you kind of have this perspective and that dope kind of breakdown of your program that's really national. What are you seeing in terms of independent political power? And like I said, like, what are you seeing as some of the big victories or some things that we're like, why enter into all of this?
So I understood your question in two ways. I'll answer it the first way, and if I'm not answering, just cut me off. But
great.
The first is, I think the one victory, and goes to my initial, is the victory of self-organization, is that we're starting to actually see more and more capacity building on the ground where folks are running committees and exerting power and taking leadership is huge, I think, and I think not to be undervalued. The second is we have immediate victories in participation in $15 increases minimum wage, right, which are immediate short-term victories for people. We had changes in campaign finance laws. We've had victories. We take credit, not us individually, but our work along with the rest of not only labor movement, but progressive movement to helping to kill TPP, right? Because the fight we waged on fast track prolonged that fight for over 2-3 years when it should have been wrapped up in 3 months, and therefore made it an issue and helped kill it. And so we've seen quite a bit of victories that actually are tangible, concretely impacting not only our membership in the sense of offshoring of jobs, et cetera, but also folks outside of our membership. And so we see this as real immediate victories. And then the long term is that they've helped create and forge more close alliances on the ground with different organizations that we might have not have been working with in the past because of this organization. I apologize for that. So those are some of the victories that we've had.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if people like really heard what you said, because you said it in a real brief way, but I just want to lift up like what it means that y'all built this national campaign, and we're playing a huge role in leading around like working class people, making the Trans-Pacific Partnership like the neoliberal dream of the next step. Helping to kill that. And we're in the current situation that we're in right now with the current political arrangement. But like imagining what would the world look like if on top of the Trump administration, we also had TPP, right? And thinking about, how many people got developed and transformed in that process. And both of y'all talking about the new relationships that got built. Here in Durham, we've talked about, or we got the experience of electoral work actually being an arena like y'all are talking about, where forces who are otherwise not work together get the experience of making those kinds of massive impacts. And at least for us, one of the big challenges that we're always up against is hopelessness with our people. And I know whether it's the left or people on doors, hearing about the victories from TPP to the Lumumbas in Mississippi has been so important for kind of breaking through that hopelessness. And is one of the roles that we think this kind of work can play. So I just wanted to be like, that shit is dope.
If I could just add one little thing to that.
Please.
And I think that we are barely starting to scratch the surface on running. Like, I think the work that Rukia and folks did in Cooperation Jackson on Chokwe, they have a legacy and a history. We just our folks have been there involved, but we just showed up a little bit late to that game in a more serious way, et cetera, even though our local was engaged. But we're starting to see across the country hundreds of people who are running on the same kind of platform. And if we can engage on that and take power, then again, we might win an election and not have real power, but we start to take major inroads in that fight for power, for real power.
Let's see, we're gonna go ahead and start pulling questions from the question box. And if you are having any kind of technical challenges, we have Rishi, who's our tech support person. And so you can reach out to him there. So let's start, let's see. One of our juicy ones that we haven't gotten to yet is about the Democratic Party, everybody's favorite. And there's a question, how can we use the Democratic Party ballot line pragmatically while also building independent political capacity for working people? Really this question around how do we contest in a two-party dominated system? Do y'all have thoughts about that?
Yeah. So, you know, that has been the question that has been raised for us and that we ask ourselves consistently every time, the last few times that we have had people run for office. And I think that that question really has to have a local, you have to gauge the local environment, right, to determine that answer. And so, for example, Jackson, Mississippi, where the majority of the city is Democrat, right, to the point that once the Democratic primary election is held, you pretty much know who's going to win the general election, right? And so, knowing that, strategically, we have used the Democratic Party to push our agenda for people-centered government, so the People's Platform, that doesn't necessarily fall in line with the Democratic Party's principles, or not. I won't even say principles. History, right? Recent history, right? And so, we've used the Democratic Party in the same way Fannie Lou Hamer used it to really create what we call, you know, what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And so when you ask us here, you know, we say we're a Fannie Lou Hamer type of Democrat, right? We're those rogue Democrats that are really doing what is necessary for the people and not necessarily consistently following the line of the Democratic Party. And I think that that allows us to consistently develop a more independent analysis of what is needed for our locality. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah. Navarre, what you got?
I agree with everything Rukia mentioned. And for us, the CWA, we engage a lot with the Working Families Party that was started out in New York. They have fusion voting, which I won't get too much, but you can essentially vote for the same candidate on two different party lines, which is a very powerful tool. Some states, very few states have it.
Yeah.
New York is one that has it. Outside of New York, a lot of this is really focused on building capacity to drive primaries. That's the word I'd say is primaries. That's where you can essentially push and hold accountable the corporate Dems who aren't doing their job, who are against community, who are against working people, and put forward candidates who actually represent the party or represent the values of your respective organization. So for us, it's really starting to engage in primaries and pushing an agenda through that vehicle. The one thing I'd say is really targeting in places, looking at the map in your state or your city of districts where, especially can be move forward the agenda, pick up seats, right? I'll just leave it there, but I think primaries is key, is everything to change that and using the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and can I just add to that, Sendolo, real quick? It's a real quick.
Go for it.
Because I think, Raphael, you mentioned a really important point is identifying folks to run, right? And so one of the first people's assemblies that we had in Jackson, Mississippi was in the early 1990s when the community came together to hold an assembly to determine who was going to run as the first major Black candidate for mayor. And the community selected one of its great leaders, human rights activist, Henry Kirksey, right? Ended up not running, but it was a process by which the people chose who they wanted to run. And I think that that's really important, right? Identifying the appropriate people, like you said, that stand for.
Mm-hmm. Now, you made me think of something real quick, which is that, and sometimes in those examples, you might lose that election, but you still move forward your agenda, right? You are able to move forward because you pose such a threat that they have to adopt and incorporate the demands that the organizations are making and actually deliver on them, which is an example of not winning the election, but winning a little bit more power.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. 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 And I think, for us with the Inside Outside initiative, right, we're talking about being able to operate inside and outside of the Democratic Party. And one of the things that I've been in a lot of conversations with comrades about that's just very, very sobering. At this stage, the reality is that our opponents who control the Democratic Party are more capable of mobilizing more of our people than we are. And in many places, the Democratic Party can turn out more people of color and more working class people than most of our organizations. That's not true everywhere. But at least here in Durham, we really have set ourselves this goal of like, if we're gonna make the Democratic Party's current leadership marginal, irrelevant, etc., we have to at least be able to move as many of our people as they are. And that this real question of not just do we enter or not enter into the Democratic Party, but how do we contest for political leadership of our people? And the Democratic Party as a ballot line or as an organizational form or vehicle is just one arena in which we engage in that battle. And when Raphael's talking about those primaries, or Rukia, when you're talking about those processes that help people experience democracy more deeply, right? Or talking about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, really what we're doing inside of there isn't just this like, let's get inside of this entity and just use it and go along, but fighting for leadership of our people, and we have to go where they are to do that. So I always want to really make us get sobered about what does it mean to really be able to contest for leadership, and what does it mean, and why are we doing inside-outside stuff?
Yes. Thank you, Sendolo. You just, yes.
Yeah.
That's why I like y'all. Y'all be pumping me up and stuff.
Can I speak to the, you made me think of something that I think that it's powerful. You really laid it out. And the one thing I've been thinking about this call and prepping for this call is, let's say we want to think about more different kinds of action of taking power. And I'm just throw some out, like a general strike, right? If we were even at that level, how can we get to doing a general strike if we can't even organize our folks to take power on an electoral that requires a lot less participation, and the lift is probably a fraction of what that would require? So I think your point is, to me, that we have to be about building up individuals to, as you said, infrastructure, power, developing leaders, so that these are stepping stones to building more of it, right? And if you really want to get to that point, you better be able to win a couple city council elections in your city, or else I don't know what we're talking about on a mass, on a general strike.
Right. So holding that, right? Like talking about how do we get to these bigger scales, really leading more and more of our people. One of the challenges that we've seen is, like, as we start moving to that scale, there are real pressures to start ignoring people who have less power in our society, right? And, who's already the registered voters? Who are the consistent voters? They're generally less progressive than the folks who we're trying to bring into the process, right? And Rukia, you were talking about this really great stuff at the beginning around centering the folks who are most affected and often most marginalized, but at the same time trying to build this broader united front, right? We saw both the Lumumba campaigns had to reach out to a wide range of people, but like folks who got a revolutionary history, folks who are talking about centering the most affected. So how have y'all really worked to keep most affected folks and most marginalized folks at the center of what you do, even as you're engaging in those broader united fronts? That's one of the questions that's coming out of our question box.
Yeah, and that's a really great question. And one way we do it is, honestly, is just in transparency and truthfulness. Like we consistently, even when talking to folks who are in the upper echelons, those that have more money, that are definitely not marginalized, right? And are probably in some way contributing to the oppression of the marginalized, is that we are consistent in helping them to understand that our goal is to ensure that all of our residents, all of our citizens are taken care of, and that their contributions in whatever form it is, whether it is financial, whether it is through people resource or whatever, that their contribution does not do anything but gain good governance, right? And in so doing that, we're very clear with them that we stick to our principles around making sure that the most marginalized. And one of the ways that we have been able to bring in those that sit at the margins are through these people's assemblies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And through our intentional outreach and investigation around how to reach, how to increase access to information, how to increase engagement in the governmental process with those that are most impacted by the oppressions that we experience here in Mississippi. And so, for example, currently we have a Democratic Visioning Committee of our transition team for the mayor's office. That committee will be a year to 2 year project. And the purpose of that committee is to, one, establish people's assemblies that are not just town halls or places that temporarily pop up to provide voice for people, but are actually institutions that are institutionalized, right? That are social institutions because they provide weight, that the people have social weight in the decision-making process of city government, right? And it would take me a lot longer to talk about how we do that, have done it in the past, and how we intend to do it on a broader scale throughout the city. But the other piece of that is looking at what are the barriers that exist right now for our people to get information and be actively engaged. One of the barriers is simple language, right? One of the barriers, and when I say language, I mean how we talk, right? Organizers can sometimes talk in language people don't understand, right? Because we can be academic. So we have to recognize that, and who's the best person to be talking to our people, to be knocking on doors. So we believe in a foot game, right? We believe in knocking on doors. We also believe in looking at technology and saying everybody doesn't have internet in their homes, but most people in Jackson have a cell phone, even if they're homeless. So how do we get information to them about resources? How do we get information to them about these assemblies? How do we get information about needing their voice in this process? And that's investing more in getting information to people's cell phones, reaching out to them. And so really, and also looking at intentionally reaching out to communities that are often not considered in the process, right? So intentionally making sure that they are considered in all that we're doing. And so, you know, the data piece is one example. The People's Assemblies is one example. And this Democratic Visioning Committee we have that is made up of a diverse group of 15 people who are creating opportunities to create a citywide initiative that'll be made up of at the very least, what we hope is to get at least 1/5 of the population of each ward out, right, to participate in these processes of putting forth solutions for problems that exist in the city, and particularly in their communities. Yeah.
I want to. You said what?
I hope that answered the question. I can be long-winded. So,
right.
yeah.
So I want to give another question to Raphael, but just do one more kind of like lift up thing with Rukia, because what you just said about 5% of each ward, really setting a goal around how many people in a defined territory are we going to define as success. I just think it's so powerful. And one of the things that I really appreciate about a lot of our labor union comrades is that when they're trying to win recognition or fight around a contract, they're like, we have a number, we have a territory, we have a space, and we know that we've won or lost if this happens. I mean, it's really talking about each of those people is powerful, not because we want them to be, or we feel bad for them, or we want to give them power, but if they don't go along, the shit don't work, right? And I think it's just so powerful that y'all have defined that 5%. And I think folks should really look at the writing that the comrades in Jackson have done around defining like what is a permanent People's Assembly really mean and look like, and that kind of definition, that kind of scale, and that kind of accountability.
And Sendolo, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one thing that you just said. The one thing that's really important is that our people's assemblies aren't vehicles for government to come to and present information to solely. It's really vehicles for the people to present to government and say, this is what we want to see happen, and for government to get feedback from the people before they even create a policy or process, right? So that the people's voice is actually guiding the development of the process and procedure. And I only say that because in history, we've often allowed government to just work one way, where they come to us, even in their best sense, come and say, okay, this is what we're going to propose. Do y'all agree with it? And we want to kind of take a different route and say, actually, we know that the experts of community are the people that reside in it, and that live in it at the day-to-day levels without much privilege that the government has. And so they have the opportunity to present some solutions that government then takes and drafts a plan with and comes back to. So that's our ideal method. Sorry.
Cool. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So one of the things our movements have been focused on, right, is putting pressure on elected officials, right? And what you're talking about, Rukia, is like trying to build out some new processes for things to move up, right? And not just from the top down. But we got a really great question that's about, okay, we get people into office, right? We put our people in there. And there are all kinds of contradictions. Rukia, you talked about the sales tax, right? Or talked about like actually the speed of the state's attack on the city doesn't allow for the participatory process that y'all would prefer, right? And so then our elected officials who are kind of in enemy territory, so to speak, are in the midst of these competing interests. The question in the question box talks about lobbyists. When I was in office, real experiences with the appointed administration, all the bureaucracy that's inside of there, right? And often when we think about getting our people into office, very importantly, we're like, how do we hold our people accountable? But the reason I like this question is that it asks, well, what role should we be playing to support the people who we've elected to govern when they've entered into those contradictions? And I'm curious, Raphael, if y'all have had that experience, maybe because y'all are national and there have been multiple people that you've supported and unions have played that role historically, if y'all have some insights about how do you both hold people accountable and help people navigate that hostile terrain?
Yeah. Before I specifically answer that, I just wanted to really agree with you and recognize the work that Rukia said about the 5%. I think that's powerful. And though I know we do that on a contract fight, I don't think labor does that as in the same way. I know we don't do it in the same way on political fights. And I know that's a more relatively new thing. And so we're still trying to do that in a good way. So it's really awesome to see that you all are doing that in that goals. That said, to your point on support, you know, a lot of times an elected official can want to take a difficult stand. And if they don't have massive amounts of popular support, whether it be letters, calls, that's like an air cover. That's like a cover for them to take the positions because they're going to get hit by all these other interests. And so a lot of these organizations on the ground, what they can do is basically mount massive letter writing phone calls so that elected official can point to and say, I can't take a different position because I have 1,000 letters telling me not to. And so if you're talking about support, I think it's critical not to mention some sort of rally. So even though if that person's on your side, taking active saying, thank you, you know, for doing the right thing, we need you to stay strong, etc., is critical to shoring up that person who is taking the difficult position, many times in opposition to even progressive institutional organizations that you would think would be on your side and that are not, right? And so that's the other piece, right? And many times that's us. So it's important to have that massive amount of base support that elected official can point to and say, I can't do anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question? You're on mute, Sendolo.
Great, sorry about that. Hopefully, folks at this point in the call are feeling real thirsty. They're like, I need some more, which is great because this is just one of a series of conversations that we're in. This isn't the end point, but we also want to have a practice of being able to start and end and respecting folks' time so folks will come back the next time. So I really just want to thank you two comrades for bringing your experience and really being open and frank about like what you've seen. Really want to appreciate all the folks who have been in the chat box. If you haven't been looking, go ahead and open it up. There's been some discussions happening there about how to bring in folks who have been disenfranchised, right? There's just thoughts that are in that chat thread that are really, really helpful. Thank y'all again. I'm gonna pass things over to Joe to give us some closing remarks. Joe, you there?
Yep, I'm here. I just wanted, first of all, to thank Rukia, Sendolo, Raphael, and Calvin. I think in the chat box, loads of people have said this was a very empowering call. I want to also thank the endorsing organizations for the Left Inside Outside Project, Left Roots, CPUSA, Freedom Road Socialist Organizing Committee, and CCDS. And also thanks to those members of DSA who are supporting the Left Inside Outside Project. Just a few words to sum up. History demonstrates that meaningful social change can only occur if mass social movements organize and disrupt from the outside, but also pressure progressive electeds to deliver meaningful social reforms on the inside. That's really the theme of tonight's call, but also of future calls we'll have. Go to Organizing Upgrade to see the Left Inside Outside trend statement, and we'll keep you abreast via email of the next calls. But the dynamic I just described is what happened in the 30s in the CIO, in the 60s to the civil rights movement, the black and brown empowerment movement, the women's liberation movement. Today, I think we see in the fights against mass incarceration, Fight for 15, BLM, Movement for Single Payer, the possibility of a much more truly multiracial post-Sanders trend inside and outside the Democratic Party. So we want to build power in society, but also power in the electoral arena. So we look forward to working with all of you on this project. We hope you all check out the next People Take Power call. Check out Organizing Upgrade. And thanks for joining us. Good night, and let's build the left together.